My name is Wendy Baker. I'm going to be one of your hosts here today. We're going to talk a lot about data residency and specifically how InCountry is allowing for data residency within Salesforce. So thank you for joining. Before we do full introductions, we are a compliance company. So we do have a few compliance and legal T's. I will let you read them all at your own risk. I'll give you a moment here. Feel free to read our little disclaimer. Lawyers, lawyers, more lawyers. All right, I know you're all speed readers and I know you're all diligently reading this. Let us know, we'll share this afterwards. So if you need to read it again, it's probably, you can do so. So just a little bit of an introduction. Like I said, my name is Wendy Baker. I run our customer success team here at InCountry. I've spent the last 20 years in enterprise software, starting as a software developer, and now I moved over to the other side, but really it's all about solving hard problems for customers when it comes to systems and infrastructure. I am lucky to be joined today by my colleague, Peter Prose. He is our Director of Solutions Engineering here at InCountry. He spent the last 17 years building technology, which is fantastic, a lot in the financial services space. And lastly, he was at Sappho, which was just acquired by Citrix a few years ago as well. So he's used to building mission critical applications. So hopefully between the two of us, we can answer all of your questions today. And if not, we'd be happy to schedule some time later on to do that. So a little bit of structure on how this is going to work today. So we're going to give you a brief introduction of InCountry and specifically how we work with Salesforce. And then Peter is going to switch over to a demo environment and show you how our integration actually works live. And then we'll take your questions. So anything is on the table, ask us anything, stump the presenters, right? So feel free to put that in the chat. We'll answer some of them as we go along. If we can't answer them or they're not in context, we'll leave them till the end. So feel free, any questions, put them in the public chat and we'll take them and push them out there. So looking forward to our discussion today, and let's get started. So I'm going to start by giving you all a brief intro of InCountry, and then I'll quickly pass it over to Peter to talk about how our technology actually works. So a little bit about InCountry. We are a little over 2.5 years old, although we have been working on the technology for a little over 4 years. When we saw this problem, our CEO is a longtime entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. He's built and sold 6 enterprise software companies. He was also the CIO and CTO at CBS Interactive and took them into the cloud. And as he did that, he saw this problem starting to arise, is that as we started to centralize data, all of these new regulations were starting to come in play where countries were starting to mandate that they wanted jurisdiction over their data. And so now we're being asked to move that data back out. Most of us here at InCountry are pretty seasoned. We've all been around enterprise software for many years. We currently have a little over 100 employees and we are globally distributed. By the nature of our business, our customers are globally distributed. So it's nice to be where they are. We have offices all around San Francisco, Charlotte. We have an office in Abu Dhabi, Singapore, Moscow, Minsk. We have raised a little over 44 million in funding thus far from the likes of Mubadala out of Abu Dhabi. Accenture came in our last round, Arbor out of Singapore, and Rocket out of Berlin. So again, we have a global set of investors as well because we all believe that this problem is only going to get bigger and it's going to be a global problem. So a little bit about the problem, right? Global data residency, this is really trending up very, very quickly. There are a lot of regulations coming into the fold. We're seeing them every day. Some of the ones you may be aware of, something like Russia has FC 152. China has a lot of new data protection laws in place. The UAE, Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, Vietnam, Kenya. These are all places that we're seeing starting to enforce these regulations. On a daily basis, we tend to see a lot of hotspots. And when we say hotspots, this is where our customers are really being asked to start complying with these regulations. Again, Russia is probably one of the top places that we see. They do have a law called FC 152. It basically requires that you store any PII data locally within the country first. It has to be the primary copy. It has to be updated and deleted there first, but then it can usually be copied out and processed normally inside of the country. We also see very strict regulations in places like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, And in many of these cases, the regulators are asking that the data not only be stored there locally, but in many cases it can't be transported out and it has to be processed there locally. And we'll talk about the ways that we can solve for these different models of integrations, because there's different regulations that you have to comply to based on the country that you're going to be doing business in. Now, I always like to have caveats, just like the one we had at the very beginning, right, is that these regulations can be complex. They are also interpreted in many different ways. And so because of that, we don't actually give legal advice. What we can do is share our experiences, share what our customers have traditionally done in many of these countries. And the reason we don't is because we tend to see these regulations falling into one of three buckets. One are these very explicit regulations. They're fairly easy to interpret. They're usually interpreted in the same way many times, and this is really about the government having control over the data. Then we see what we call effective regulations, and these are a little more fuzzy. This is really if you're a global business and you're doing business in certain jurisdictions, sometimes it's just known that they want the data stored there. You're going to have a better chance of winning that business if you can store the data there locally. We see this a lot in places like Switzerland, China, Turkey, where the law isn't completely clear. And then the last could just be company policies. With the Schrems Act over in Europe, we are seeing a lot of companies now say, we don't want to wait and see what's going to happen. We're just going to have company policies that are going to require us to store data in certain locales. We also have customers who have signed contracts with their customers stating that the data has to be stored there locally. So there are different interpretations of these laws depending on the industry that you're in, the type of contract, and the local regulatory environment that you're working in. And so we work with our customers. Our goal is not to store all of your data. It's not for us to replicate the entire Salesforce infrastructure, but it's really to help you define what are those sensitive bits or regulated bits that are required to be stored locally. Now, once we've defined what those little bits are, usually it's 5 fields, 20 fields. Again, it's not the whole database. Then we have to look at the rules around that data. The first is, where does that data have to be stored, right? What country does it need to be stored in? Do you need it encrypted in that country? Can it be transported out of the country? So for example, I know some of the draft language in the Indian regulation states that it can leave the country for 24 hours, but then you have to get rid of it there and it has to be stored in India. So we have to understand the rules around the data storage regulations. The second is the visibility of that data. Can that data be visible inside or outside of the jurisdiction? So if I have users logging into my Salesforce system and they're coming from, let's say, the UK, can they see healthcare data from the UAE? Right? So what's the visibility rules? And then the third is just the processing of that data. Can that data be processed inside or outside of the jurisdiction? So you can imagine, I'll give you a great example. If a customer came to us and said, hey, we're working in a jurisdiction like the UAE, and healthcare data can only be visible inside of the country, if some of the fields that you choose to what we call redact, right, and store only locally, we're going to store a hash back in Salesforce. Right? It's a non-reversible hash. And if you have any process builders or triggers or any logic that's going to run on those particular fields that you've chosen to be regulated, that may break. And so we may need to move some of that processing back into the country locally. And we do have a way of doing that today so that we can support those more restrictive models inside of some of these countries. And Peter will talk about how this is done. From a technology perspective, but just wanted to set the stage there a little bit. So where are we today as a company? So as a company, we actually have the ability to physically store data in a little over 90 countries. That means that we manage the infrastructure in those countries. We set up the servers and the points of presence, and we manage that. You don't have to worry about where it's being hosted. We'll tell you where it's hosted, but we'll take care of all of that. We can not only store the data locally, but we can also process it. And then in every country that we work in, our goal is always to have 2 points of presence. And that is so that we can offer high availability and redundancy. Typically, they're on 2 different power grids with 2 different providers, depending on the country. And then lastly, we are a security and compliance company. So that means we take all the controls we have in place very seriously. So we do have things like SOC 2 in place already. We have ISO certifications in place. We are PCI DSS compliant, so we can store credit card data, and we can do HIPAA business agreements, so we can store healthcare data as well. Again, we're storing sensitive and regulated data, so those controls are important for us, and more importantly for you all to know that we're taking good care of your data while we have it in our possession. Okay. I'm going to kind of pause there because I know that was kind of a lot, and now we're going to get into the fun bits, and Peter's going to walk us through how this actually works with Salesforce. So if you have any questions, again, put them in the chat. We'll be happy to take them in real time, and if we can't answer them in real time, we'll keep them to the end and make sure we get them answered.
All right. Hello, everyone. Wendy, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
All right, excellent. Let's get this started. All right, so our goal with InCountry is to enable our customers to continue to benefit from the efficiency of scale, of monitoring, of centralization that comes with this cloud-hosted application architecture. So typically when a customer purchases one of these cloud-hosted applications, it would be hosted in one country or one geographic region, and all of the data that is collected and stored there and processed there can come from a variety of different countries. The issue that comes up is when one of those countries has some data residency legislation, or if there's a company operating in one of those countries that would just prefer via company policy to have their regulated data stored inside their own country. So what InCountry provides is both of the integrations that can be included into the application itself in order to make call-outs to store and retrieve regulated data as needed, as well as running the managed infrastructure inside these countries so that the regulated data can be stored at rest, in compliance, and on soil, and satisfying these data residency requirements. Right. So the first thing that we discuss with most of our customers is how this data residency legislation or this company policy affects the integration model. So typically with a, when you're operating in a country that has these data residency requirements, but you want to use a cloud provider that is hosted in a different country, the standard configuration is that all of the data is stored outside the country. The data can be viewed outside the country, and the data can also be processed outside the country. But when these data residency requirements are introduced, there could be restrictions on where the data can be stored, viewed, and processed. So based on these parameters, we've defined 3 different integration models. So we call them, the first is the replicated model. And this is where the primary copy of the regulated data has to be stored inside the country, but a permanent copy can be kept outside the country as well. So the data can be stored in and out, viewed in and out, processed in and out. The issue, the main issue here is that anytime any records are created or updated or deleted, that action first has to be applied to the copy kept inside the country, and then can subsequently be applied to the copy kept outside the country. And we have noticed that a lot of our customers have interpreted Russia's FC 152 regulation governing the PII of Russian citizens to follow this model. Another model is the restricted model. And in this one, the regulated data can only be stored inside the country. But the key to this integration is the cross-border transfer of data for viewing and processing is still permitted. So you can have a user outside the country who can view the data if they request it from an in-country data store. Or you can have a server outside the country request the data from an in-country store, perform some processing on the data, and then subsequently drop the data. With the restricted model, one of the examples that we have seen is is in India. There's draft legislation that is explicitly stating that the regulated data can leave the country for 24 hours for processing, but then after that 24-hour period is over, the data can only be stored inside the country. And then if there's an application or viewer outside the country who would need to see it again, as long as they request it from inside the country, they would be permitted to see it. And then finally, there's the redacted model, where the regulated data can only be stored, viewed, and processed inside the country. So in this scenario, if there is any server-side processing that it references regulated data, then that would have to be re-implemented as something that can run on the in-country processing module inside the country. So we're able to support all three of these different models. It's just a question of the complexity of the integration. It increases as you move from left to right. So it's very important to understand what the model is required in every country. And it's also very important to define what is regulated data as narrowly as possible to minimize the effort involved in the implementation. So specific to Salesforce, what in-country is able to provide is an extension of the existing Salesforce features and functionality, but allowing data residency. So when a customer purchases Salesforce today, they would have to choose one of 7 countries where that Salesforce org can be deployed. And they don't have the option for multi-country storage by default. All of the data is stored and processed in that single country. And there would not be any way by default for them to restrict who would be able to view the data based on where they're trying to access the data from. So with the in-country integration, this can be expanded where the countries where you can store the data can be any of the 90+ countries where in-country operates. You could have a single Salesforce instance configured to connect to multiple in-country points of presence and store that regulated data in those countries. And then you could also set it up such that only users within a particular country would be able to access the regulated data for that country. So we've been able to build this functionality into our in-country managed package and deliver it to our users in a relatively turnkey experience. So the way we do this is, so in-country at its core is a collection of tools. So we offer SDKs, we offer a REST API, we offer a variety of gateways that can help to bring the workflows in those applications, the cloud applications, into compliance. Salesforce is special because it has a very open and accessible development platform. So we have been able to incorporate the in-country REST API directly into the browser-based components, the Lightning Web components of Salesforce, as well as the server-side components, the Apex components of Salesforce, and deliver that functionality as a managed package. So that includes an admin console where an administrator at a customer can go in and configure which objects contain regulated data, as well as which fields within those objects are specified as regulated data. So if you think of a contact object, it would be things like first name, last name, email address, phone number, things like that. And then you're also able to take care of any of the other configurations governing how the data is hashed and stored in Salesforce if necessary, as well as taking care of any of those implementations of the serverless functions and connecting them to the triggers inside Salesforce. So there is some development work depending on the complexity of the integration, but the majority of what is done is just configuration in the in-country managed package. So just to put a picture to a lot of the words, this is what a typical Salesforce integration looks like for one of our customers right now. So without in-country, they would be so they would have the Salesforce Lightning interface communicating via the standard Salesforce protocol to the Salesforce cloud application server outside the country. And that would be then in turn storing all of the regulated and non-regulated data commingled in that single Salesforce cloud data store. So again, there's no separation of regulated and non-regulated data geographically, and there's no restriction for where the data is stored or how it is visible based on where that Salesforce user is coming from. So for the 3 different integration models, replicated, restricted, and redacted, there are different data flows associated with the in-country solution that is provided by our managed package. And I'll go through each of those in detail. So first off, in the replicated model, this is a case where the Lightning interface user, that Salesforce user, can be located either inside or outside the country. Because again, in this case, the data it can be stored both inside and outside the country. So if a user wants to create create a record, they would send that request out to the Salesforce Cloud application server. But the first thing that has to happen here is that the regulated data fields would be committed to the in-country point of presence and therefore stored in the in-country regulated data store. And then once that's acknowledged, then the same regulated data fields can be written to the Salesforce Cloud Data Store. Now, again, all of the non-regulated data is still stored here. So later, if a user requests to view a screen that contains this data, they'd send that request to the Salesforce Cloud Server, which could then retrieve it from the Salesforce Cloud Data Store and display it to the user. So there's no impact from the in-country integration on read operations, as well as reporting and server-side processing. However, anytime a record is created or updated or deleted, there would have to be an interaction within country to ensure that the regulated data is kept updated as the master copy of those for the regulated data associated with those records. Right. Now, for the restricted model, the picture looks very similar. The lines are very similar, but the wording is a little different. So in this case, once again, the user can be inside or outside the country because the regulated data is permitted to cross borders, but the regulated data can only be stored inside the country in this model. So in this case, if a user wants to create some regulated data field or a record containing regulated data, they'd send that request out to the Salesforce Cloud Server, which would write the regulated data to the in-country point of presence, and then write hashes in place of that data to the Salesforce Cloud Data Store. So here in Salesforce, there would just be non-regulated data stored in clear text, as well as hashes stored in the place of the regulated data fields. So later on, if a user wants to view that data, that request would be sent to Salesforce, and then a request would be made to both the in-country point of presence as well as the Salesforce Cloud Data Store to retrieve the regulated and non-regulated data, respectively, and then it would be recombined and delivered to the end user. So in this model, the restricted model, the in-country integration is required for both the reads and the writes. It's not a case where it's just the read interactions anymore. Right. And then finally, there is the redacted model, and this is the one where the regulated data can only be stored, viewed, and processed in the country. So the big assumption here is that the origin of the data is also inside the country. So you see now that the Salesforce Lightning Interface user has moved completely above the red line. So the assumption is that this is a user inside a regulated country, writing details about a contact or a lead who is also from the same country. And that regulated data needs to be stored inside the country. But the non-regulated data and application metadata associated with that record in the Salesforce CRM system can still be stored outside in the Salesforce Cloud Server. So in this integration, when a user wants to create one of these records, our integration with the Lightning Web Components would intercept the regulated data fields and replace them with hashes. So that hashed payload would be sent on to the Salesforce Cloud Store, and that is what is written to the Salesforce Data Center. And then once that is acknowledged, then the regulated data fields can be written to the in-country point of presence via the InCountry REST API integration with that Salesforce managed package. So in this way, we're able to ensure that the regulated data never crosses the red line, but that a user inside the country is able to write data and it's stored compliantly. And then when they read the data later on, it is retrieved from the two different data stores, non-regulated data from Salesforce, regulated data from InCountry, and it is recombined and rendered to the end user in those list view and detail view pages that they're accustomed to seeing inside Salesforce. Right. So what I've covered so far is speaking exclusively to the end user's experience using the Salesforce Lightning interface, but there are also a lot of integrations that are done to Salesforce that are outside the Lightning interface. So typically those would be using the Salesforce standard API. And for those in the redacted model, we are still able to support those while still providing the same level of data residency protection with our border gateway solution. So in this case, if you can imagine a browser-based web form where a user would be submitting some personally identifiable information about themselves, and submitting that data for creation of a lead or creation of a contact inside a Salesforce system. So typically, those REST API requests would be sent directly from the client application to the Salesforce cloud application. But the problem here is that then the regulated data in that payload would be stored clear text in the cloud data store. So what we have created is our border gateway. So the client application would have to be reconfigured to, instead of send those requests directly to Salesforce, to send it to our border gateway that is running co-located with our point of presence inside the country. And that border has a configuration attached to it saying, for this REST API endpoint, this is the data structure that is passed in that contains all of the information for creating a lead or creating a contact. And these are the fields within the data structure that are considered regulated data. So things like first name, last name, email address, things like that. So it's able to store those regulated data fields in the in-country point of presence, replace them with hashes, and then pass that hash payload on to the Salesforce Cloud Application Server. So again, all that's being stored here is non-regulated data that was passed through unchanged and regulated data that was replaced with hashes. And then later on, if that application issues a read request via the Salesforce API, that request would be passed through the border to the Salesforce application. And then the response would come back from Salesforce with that payload containing non-regulated data and hashes in the place of regulated data. And then the border gateway would apply unredaction rules to replace those hashes with the clear text regulated data, and then deliver that clear text payload to the end user. So in this way, the users inside the country, or the integrations inside the country that are querying data or inserting data into Salesforce, would still be able to have the same functionality, but still be compliant with those data residency requirements. And typically, there would be some combination of both of those for one of our customer solutions. So again, on the top half of the screen, you see the Salesforce Lightning Interface integration using the in-country REST API to communicate with the point of presence. And then on the bottom half, you see the client web form using the in-country border proxy to take care of the Salesforce API related requests. So in both cases, the in-country point of presence in that country would be storing all of the regulated data, whereas Salesforce on the back end would be taking care of all the application metadata, all of the orchestration, as well as all the non-regulated data. So our customers can still have that same Salesforce experience, but still be compliant with these data residency requirements. All right. And now I would like to show you a bit of how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and share a separate screen so that you can see exactly what the console looks like and what the user experience is like. All right. I will assume everyone can see my screen unless one of my colleagues here tells me otherwise. So what you see here is a Salesforce org. This is our demonstration org where we have the in-country managed package installed. And this is the settings page, which is the core of where the configurations for the in-country managed package would be done. So just a quick tour. There's a basic description of the levels of, basically the levels of PII data policies that you're able to set. So we support an org-wide setting, an object level setting, or a record level setting. We also have a summary of basically the different integration models that are available, as well as configurations on exactly, some configurations on the points of presence that are set up associated with this org, as well as a few flags that determine how the particular instance behaves. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that one of the flags we have set here is that the country of the user is taken from their user profile as opposed to their IP address. So for the benefits of my demo, even though I'm running this out of Miami in the US, I have set up my user such that I am based in Saudi Arabia. So that is the country field of my profile. So I will be, this instance is set up to store data in the redacted model in our Saudi Arabia point of presence, but I will still be able to view it because I am considered a Saudi Arabia user based on this user profile setting. And one of the other things that we have set up here is the different endpoints that we communicate with. This particular instance has a Saudi Arabia endpoint. So this is the in-country multi-tenant REST API endpoint, where all of the requests from this Salesforce org will be going. And there's also a separate China instance where some of the regulated data can be stored. So in the, I'll start by just going over a couple of the different object configurations that we have set up here. So if I start with the contact object, so what we have here, you can see that in this, we're able to select from any of the standard or custom objects that have been set up in this particular Salesforce instance. So we stick with the contact object because everyone's very familiar with this. And you're able to specify particular policies for the individual objects. So you're able to specify the type. So basically at what level it's done, if you want everything in the org to be stored in a particular point of presence, or if you just want it to be done at a record or object level. You can specify a country where the data would be stored. You can pick from one of the three integration models that I've described, and then you can specify any field that might be used as a country identifier. So in this particular case, we have a record level configuration for the redaction model, and then there's a country field associated with the record. So any record that contains the value SA in this country field will be sent to our Saudi Arabia point of presence. And anything with CN set up in this country field will be sent to our China point of presence. So once you've set up these policies, then you can specify which fields are considered regulated data. So again, this is all pulled from the metadata. So if I wanted to add another phone number as a regulated data field, or I wanted to specify a particular hash function that would be used for one of these fields when the data is stored in Salesforce, or if I wanted to make it one of the searchable keys that we're able to retrieve data from in-country for, I'm able to specify all of that here from this admin console. Now, as you can see, several of the fields have already been pre-configured, but please note that a couple of the phone number objects have not been configured as regulated data. So those would still be stored in clear text on the Salesforce cloud server. All right. So now that we've seen what the configuration looks like, what does it actually look like to the end user? So I'll go over to the contacts page here. All right. Now, as you can see, there is some data that is clearly visible, and you can see that the country for those is Saudi Arabia. So I can see Jonathan Flores, Jonathan Ray here, their country is SA. But for all of these items that are set up as CN, I'm not able to see the name, I'm not able to see the title, because these have been configured as regulated data fields and therefore not visible outside China. All right. So I'm going to do a quick filter, all right, so that I can see a couple of items that I've created recently. And if I go ahead and click on the entry for James Kirk, so you can see that as a Saudi Arabia user, I'm able to see all of this information on the James Kirk entry in this contact database. So I can see the title, I can see the name, I can see the email address. Now, if I did a quick search for exactly what is stored in Salesforce for this particular user, so what you can see is that the data that's actually stored in Salesforce based on this query. So the name is actually a concatenation of 2 hashes. The email is an email formatted hash. The title is a hash string, but the phone number is still clear text. So the same phone number that's displayed here, 314-2653. So I'm still able to see that phone number because that is non-regulated data and therefore stored in clear text on the Salesforce cloud server. So this begs the question, how am I able to see this data on this page, even though it's not coming from the Salesforce cloud server? So what is on this page is, this detail as well as this header are actually in-country enhanced Lightning Web Components that are able to make a direct call out to the in-country point of presence when this page is loaded to retrieve these regulated data fields for display. So I will go ahead and show you exactly what that query looks like. If we open up the developer tools and refresh the page, now we're on the network console here. So what you can see is a whole bunch of calls that are made from my browser out to Salesforce to retrieve non-regulated data, metadata, images, information on the layout, things like that. Now, there is one critical call that is made that is not to Salesforce, and it is the InCountry Find call. Now, this is made out to the in-country point of presence in Saudi Arabia. So if I click on one of these, if you look at the headers for this endpoint where the request is going is the same as the endpoint that was set up in that configuration on the settings page. So this is where the request is going out to find and retrieve the information for this particular record for James Kirk. And in the response that's coming back, we see the email address, first name, last name, title. So basically all of this information that's been considered regulated data is all being returned by this request. Now, you'll notice that the phone number is not included in that data because, again, that is being retrieved from the Salesforce cloud server because it's not regulated data in this particular configuration. So by making these two calls and then being able to combine them in the our implementation, we're able to ensure that the end user still has the same user experience, but that the data is stored and retrieved from that local point of presence. Now, a little bit earlier, I touched on the ability to not only enter, have the data stored and retrieved from the user interface, but from Proxy Integration as well. So in this case, I'm just going to quickly go to a site that we've set up. So this happens to be a force.com hosted site, but this could be hosted anywhere. There's no need for it to be hosted on force.com. This could be hosted on any web server. But what we have configured here is a simple web form that will submit a request to create a contact in this Salesforce demo org. So if I enter some data for a particular contact, so when I make this request to save the entry, this is being sent to the in-country border proxy and then being relayed on to the Salesforce cloud server. So for anyone on the call who is familiar with the way the Salesforce REST API requests are constructed, you'll notice that the suffix here is the same as what you're accustomed to, but instead of the prefix being the typical Salesforce URL, it is instead the in-country proxy that is going to be relaying this request to the Salesforce URL. So in this case, the authorization is being sent, and you can see in this little debug output the body that was sent, and then the response, which contains the ID for that newly created Salesforce record that was the result of this request. Now, if I take this exact same ID for the William Smith entry and go back into my same Salesforce instance and look that up, so by default, we have that one set up to route to Saudi Arabia. And again, I can see all of the information for this user. But if I do that same quick query for the data that is stored in in-country, or sorry, the data that is stored in Salesforce for this new Will Smith entry, you can see that once again, the name is hashed, the email address is hashed, the title is hashed, but that phone number remained as clear text because there was no configuration in our border proxy to replace that phone number with a hash. So what you see here is exactly what you see here. All right. And then just one final note, if we switch back to the contacts page here, Now, this is displaying a variety of different contacts, some in Saudi Arabia, some in China, but as a Saudi Arabia user, I'm only able to see the ones that are stored in Saudi Arabia. So if I go ahead and make a switch for my user, to instead say that I am domiciled in China as opposed to Saudi Arabia, so once that change is made, if I refresh this page, you will see that now, instead of being able to see the Saudi Arabia data, I am now able to see all of the data that's stored in the in-country point of presence in China. We are able to support Chinese characters, Arabic characters, so it's not just the Romanized versions of these that we're storing. But now, since I am the China user, I'm able to see all of this regulated data stored in the other point of presence that's associated with this particular instance of Salesforce.
If you've got a specific use case that you would like to discuss with us, please just reach out to sales@incountry.com. We'll route it to the right team member. We have team members all over the world. We're happy to work with you and discuss your specific use case and see if we can help you, whether it's a Salesforce use case or a custom application that you need to localize the data. With that, thank you all for coming. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon.